Hey everybody, Smart Silver Stacker here. I don't know about you, but to me, it seems like things in the world are accelerating. I feel like we are reaching some kind of a major event, and I don't know exactly what that's going to be, but the pace of change, the pace of these major developments is accelerating, and it seems like the risk is growing. And I did a video 2 months ago about reasons that I'm stacking silver in 2022. And, so much has changed in the 2 months since I put that video out. It feels like almost every day now we're getting new reasons to stack gold and silver. And so I just want to cover some of these more recent developments. I mean, there's so much to talk about. We've got de-dollarization. We've got escalating economic warfare. Now we're putting sanctions on China. We've got the biggest sanctions in history against Russia. Now we're putting sanctions on China. We've got this escalating conflict in Eastern Europe. And we've also got now that trend of de-dollarization. The Russians are trying to sell their energy in rubles. They're going to force the West to pay them in rubles. So I want to talk about all of this. And I also want to talk in this video about why I think gold and silver are still extremely undervalued. Even with gold approaching a nominal all-time high, gold and silver still remain some of the most undervalued assets in the world. And we're going to go over some charts and some data, and I'm going to explain to you why I'm saying that. So with that being said, we've got a lot to cover. It's going to be a great video, so stick around and let's get to it. So last week I put out this video on de-dollarization and what de-dollarization means for gold and silver and the economy. And if you're not familiar, de-dollarization is basically a move away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency. It's a move away from the petrodollar system. Long story short, we made a deal with the Saudis back in the 1970s that they would only sell their oil for dollars, and they've been doing that ever since, and that really creates a lot of demand for the dollar, and it helps prop up the dollar's value, and it gives the US a lot of clout. And if you want to hear more about this, I definitely recommend that you go check out that video. But that de-dollarization trend, it is continuing, and we're seeing that with headlines like this. US announces new sanctions on Chinese officials over repressive acts. And this is a story from The Hill. The essence of this story is that the State Department is now putting sanctions on specific Chinese officials, and this is regarding their treatment of the Uyghurs, a ethnic minority located over in Western China. So the State Department said it would impose visa restrictions on Chinese officials it said are believed to be responsible for policies or actions aimed at repressing religious and spiritual practitioners, members of ethnic minority groups, dissidents, human rights defenders, journalists, labor organizers, civil society organizers, and peaceful protesters in China and beyond. Of course, it's very interesting that we should choose to put sanctions on Chinese officials at this moment because, of course, the Chinese, they've been abusing the Uyghurs for some time now, rounding them up, putting them into re-education camps. And they've certainly been abusing human rights for decades now. I mean, ever since Mao took over, horrible human rights history in China. So why are we choosing to put these sanctions on them now? Well, I think it has something to do with this. This is a headline that we got from Reuters earlier today. U.S. sets red lines for China helping Russia dodge sanctions. And so the U.S. is throwing its weight around. It's trying to make sure that China does not assist Russia in sidestepping sanctions. Of course, they're going to do that. They're going to provide Russia whatever help they can without instigating too much of a conflict with the U.S. And I think that these sanctions that we just imposed on these Chinese officials is absolutely related to this. It's got nothing to do with the human rights of the Uyghurs. I feel bad for them, of course, but this is just some real politic, and we are showing China that we mean business and that we will not tolerate them assisting the Russians because we are really trying to put the squeeze on Russia right now, of course. And actions like this, sanctioning China, this is exactly the sort of thing that is going to push China away from using the US dollar. If we begin threatening them with sanctions and imposing sanctions on their officials, it is going to further incentivize them to de-dollarize their economy and end their reliance on the US dollar because they've seen what we did to Russia. We froze Russian dollar assets, and we'll get into that more in just a minute. China's not stupid. They know that if the dollar can be used against them, that they need to end their dependence on it. So this is going to accelerate that trend towards de-dollarization that I covered in that video last week. Speaking of which, Putin now is saying that unfriendly countries, read the West, any countries that are sanctioning them, are now going to have to buy Russian oil and gas in rubles. And of course, Europe is highly dependent on Russian energy supplies. Despite what's going on, they are still purchasing gas and energy from Russia. They depend on it. And now Russia is going to spin this thing around, and they are going to demand that everybody buy their oil and gas in rubles. And this is just like what the US has been doing with the dollar for decades. We've been insisting that everybody purchase their crude oil with dollars. Anybody who has moved away from that has suffered a horrible fate. Muammar Gaddafi down in Libya, he was, I believe, thinking of selling oil from Libya for a gold dinar or something along those lines, like establishing a hard money currency. And we saw what happened to him. And then the same for Saddam Hussein. Before the invasion of Iraq and the U.S. deposing Saddam, he had been thinking of selling some oil for euros. Well, he found out what that gets you. But now we're seeing this reversed on us, and Putin's probably not going to be as easy to deal with as Saddam was or as Gaddafi was. And I'll read you a little bit of this article. Sanctions aimed at the Russian central bank effectively froze hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. The actions immediately drove down the value of the ruble as people frantically rushed to turn their rubles into a more stable currency like the dollar or the euro. And then more from this article. The central bank took several steps to support the currency, including doubling interest rates to 20% as a way to entice people to keep their rubles in the bank. That freeze, Mr. Putin said, was evidence that the dollar and euro compromised themselves and were unreliable. And this is exactly the sort of language that we're going to begin to see more from BRICS nations and other nations around the world who don't want to be put in the position that Russia is in right now, where the dollar is being weaponized against them. They want to get out of this dependency on the dollar so they're not so susceptible to sanctions or from being cut off from Western financial systems. And then more from the article, Klaus Vistisen, chief Eurozone economist at Pantheon Macroeconomics, said the action meant that every time a Western country bought a barrel of oil, it would be propping up his domestic currency. If you're invoiced in rubles, you've got to go out and buy rubles, he said. I don't know if there is a workaround. And that's exactly right. This is a petro-ruble. It's the petrodollar, but in reverse. Putin is no fool, and Russia is the world's biggest exporter of crude oil and energy, and he knows that that is a very powerful hand that can be played by doing things like this. Now, speaking of Putin and Russia and the Ukraine conflict, this is something that continues to alarm me as well. The Ukraine war, NATO to send more troops to Eastern Europe. This is a headline we got from the BBC 5 hours ago, and we continue to see talk of NATO expanding its presence in Eastern Europe. I really am concerned that there is the potential for this to break out into a wider conflict. I know we're seeing lots of headlines about how Russia is being defeated in Ukraine and it's not going according to plan. Well, I don't know if it's going to according to their plan or not, but this is still a very young war. I mean, it was about 30 days ago, I believe, that the Russians started their invasion, and that's no time at all when it comes to conquering a country. This still has the potential to get a lot worse. And, we've got people in the West calling for a no-fly zone now. That's what Zelensky asked the U.S. Congress for. And that would be a really dangerous step. If we start shooting down Russian planes, I think that that would obviously be a huge escalation, and it's something to be avoided because, honestly, the U.S. has got $30 trillion in debt. I mean, we do have a big military, but the cost of a war would likely bankrupt our nation. And, that's sort of something that you see throughout history. Big wars tend to create upsets in the geopolitical theater, in the paradigm. After World War II, Britain lost all of its colonies. Britain won World War II, ostensibly the Allies did, but Britain was bankrupted by the war, and they've never been the same. The British Empire was finished off by World War II and by the massive expense to the British government. So that is something, a lesson from history that we should certainly heed, and I think it would be very destructive for the U.S. to become engaged in a wider conflict with Russia. But that might be what we get anyway. So, it's something to keep an eye on. And like I said in the introduction to this video, things are just changing so rapidly now that, the best thing we can do is get prepared. I mean, what I'm doing, I'm stacking physical, tangible assets like gold and silver, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes as well, why I think they are still so undervalued at today's prices. But it's not just the US that is ratcheting up the rhetoric and stationing more troops. Look at this. This is a clip from Russian state television. So this is a tweet from a Visegrad 24. I guess that's a news service. This is the tweet. Putin's highest paid propagandist Vladimir Soloviev and his experts at Russia's largest TV channel send new threats. And we'll just watch this clip. You can see the subtitles down there. So this guy is one of Vladimir Putin's propagandists, basically, on this state-run television network. And in this clip, he's on TV, and he is saying that if NATO sends peacekeepers that engage with Russia, that will be a nuclear war. And he goes on to say that Warsaw could be made to disappear in a split second. Estonians and Germans, the Baltic states, they could all be threatened with nuclear war. And then here he goes on to talk about making a land corridor to Kaliningrad, which is that little Russian area that is geographically separate from mainland Russia. But, this is highly inflammatory and very dangerous, I think. It's scary to think that they're threatening nuclear war. Now, is that a bluff? I don't know. But, Russia does have the world's largest nuclear arsenal, and they're certainly willing to sacrifice a lot of their own troops in this Ukraine invasion. I don't think they would really think twice about sacrificing a bunch of European lives if it helped out with whatever their geopolitical agenda is. So this is certainly something to keep an eye on. And, this guy is probably a bit of an extremist, but here's somebody, Dmitry Medvedev. This guy has long been considered a moderate in Putin's cabinet. And if you remember, Medvedev, he's the guy on the left there in the picture. He was the president of Russia from 2008 to 2012. And now he's the deputy secretary of Russia's Security Council. And he basically said that if the U.S. destabilizes Russia and attempts to depose Vladimir Putin, that it could lead to a nuclear dystopia. And his argument was essentially just that if we do remove Putin, you will have the country with the largest nuclear arsenal, with a big power vacuum, and with unreliable political leadership. And that is a very scary scenario. So certainly even, the non-hawkish Russians raise a good point that, they've got a lot of nukes, and if we destabilize their government, that could be a real problem. And speaking of the escalating hostilities between the U.S. and Russia, we got this warning recently from the FBI and also from President Biden that Russian hackers were scanning U.S. energy firms. And I put out a video earlier today on this. So if you want to hear more about the cyber attack, go check that video out on the channel. It's the one I uploaded right before this one. I go into more depth on the cyber attack and also some things that we can all be doing to get prepared for that. But I just think it's important to note that this battlefield is going to take many different forms. It's going to be economic warfare. There could be a hot kinetic war between the U.S. and Russia. That remains to be seen. We could see cyber warfare. And now the FBI has detected that Russian hackers are probing networks. And, for them to issue this warning, that means that it has to be an elevated level of activity, because I'm sure the Russians get detected probing U.S. infrastructure, and the Chinese as well. I'm sure they both are always kind of probing us out and feeling us out. They invest a lot of money into cyber warfare capabilities over there. But for them to be issuing this warning, it could be one of two things. It could be that the Russians really are preparing to do a cyber attack, or it could be that there's a false flagging coming, so who knows? We'll be the last to know, of course. If the banks get attacked, or if the financial system comes under attack, well, you're going to be really glad that you have gold and silver then if you do. Just think about the Russians. They've been having bank runs lately, and they've seen the massive depreciation of the ruble. One of the best things that individual Russian citizens could have done to get prepared for this conflict would be to have stacked precious metals outside of the banking system. So that's something to reflect on. Speaking of things accelerating, I've mentioned this book before on the channel, but I did read this book recently, The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And this book, it focuses on generational theory. It's an interesting read, but, the takeaway from this book is that they predicted that there would be a serious crisis beginning in 2020, and that was obviously pretty spot on, and that following that, the world would devolve into disorder and chaos. That's the nature of a fourth turning. It's like a crisis phase of civilization. And their prediction was that sometime around the year 2025 or 2026, we would reach the resolution of that conflict. So their predictions have been pretty spot on so far. And to the extent that they are accurate moving forward, this conflict is going to accelerate and get worse, and it's not going to reach a resolution for several years. And that's why I am stacking gold and silver now. And gold and silver are really cheap, in my opinion. This is a long-term chart of gold, and you can see we did come pretty close to hitting an all-time high. Right now, gold's at about $1,943, so we've pulled back from the recent highs, but gold's all-time high price from back in 2020 was $2,067. That's the highest it ever closed, and we came within about $10 of that recently, but we've had a little bit of a pullback since then, although seems to be getting its legs back under it now. And one of the old all-time highs was back in 1980, and you can see on this chart that gold got up to about $850 back in 1980. Now, 1980 is kind of an interesting year because we did get that big spike up in gold and silver that year. And sometimes when I talk about silver in 1980, I get a lot of flack from people in the comments saying, oh, it's just the Hunt brothers, it's just manipulation that drove the price of silver up. Well, that's why I'm looking at the gold chart, because the Hunt brothers weren't trying to corner the market on gold. There were a lot of reasons gold hit $850 in January of 1980. Among those reasons was high inflation, kind of like what we have right now, and significant geopolitical instability. The Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan, and also the Iran hostage crisis was going on at that time as well. So that combination of things, along with Paul Volcker cranking up interest rates, he did that at the end of 1979, all of those things came together and it made investors seek out the safe haven of gold. That drove the price of gold up to $850. And you'll hear a lot of talk about how we just came close to hitting an all-time high. Well, I want to go over to this CPI inflation calculator from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I've already got the numbers punched in here, so you can see that if we go from January 1980 to February of 2022, if we take $850 and we adjust for inflation, and mind you, this is using the CPI, which is the government's official numbers, and the CPI has been changed over the years. It is designed to understate inflation, but I'm not going to get too much into that in this video because we're just going to look at the actual CPI numbers. So these are the numbers that the government provides us with, and you can see that $850 high in 1980 that gold hit, if you convert that to today's dollars, you get a number of about $3,100. With gold under $2,000, we are more than 30% off of that all-time high in inflation-adjusted terms. So we are well below the inflation-adjusted high for gold that it hit back in 1980. And again, I'm not going to talk about silver because whenever I bring up silver in 1980, all I hear about is the Hunt brothers. But gold, the Hunt brothers weren't buying gold. It was normal market forces that were driving the price of gold up at that time. We have a very similar set of circumstances today, which I believe will really drive the price of gold much higher in the near future. And silver, at $25, I mean, it's so cheap right now. If gold is cheap, then silver is even cheaper. And the gold to silver ratio is still well above 70. So, silver is just a screaming deal at today's prices, I think, especially when you consider everything that's going on. I really do think that we are just in the nascent phases of a commodity bull market, which is going to extend for several years into the future. I am just trying to get my hands on more physical metal. None of this is financial advice. I'm just telling you what I'm doing. You guys need to do your own due diligence, do your own research, do what's right for you, because everybody's situation is different. As for me, when there's the threat of a cyber attack shutting down the banking system, when there's the threat of World War III breaking out, when we've got record high inflation, and yeah, I know the Fed is talking about, raising rates and getting that under control, but it's going to be very challenging for them to do that without crashing the economy, considering the fact that we've got $30 trillion in debt. So I don't really see inflation going away anytime soon. And wars, if we get into one, wars are one of the biggest drivers of inflation with all the borrowing and spending that they entail. So I'm just trying to take advantage of these low prices. Why are the prices low? Are they manipulated? Maybe. If they are, then, thanks for the manipulated lower price banks, because, I like stacking when metal is cheap personally. So maybe it's manipulated. Maybe it's not manipulation. Maybe this market just hasn't realized, what kind of trouble we're in so far with inflation and the dollar and all of the geopolitical risk that is going on. Hard to say, and I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know exactly what course things are going to take, but I think that there is a high probability that gold and silver will be moving much higher in the near future. So that's what I'm getting into. Let me know what you guys think. Are you stacking gold and silver at these prices? Do you think we're on the verge of World War III? How are you getting prepared? I would love to hear it. Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys like this video and you'd like to see more videos like it, then check out the videos that are popping up on your screen right now. Thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate everybody who watches. And if you like this video, do give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, tell your friends, and I will catch you guys next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.